Berlin, February 1943. Snow drifts silently against the tall windows of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, muffling the distant hum of a wounded city. Inside, beneath maps spread across oak tables, German generals lean over a set of intercepted industrial reports. The numbers look impossible, absurd, almost comic. One of them circles a line with his pen. United States, tank factory output, 1 every 3 days. The room falls quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock. Outside, coal smoke thickens the winter air. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in Michigan, the same rhythm echoes. Not of gunfire, but of machinery. Steel presses slam in rhythm. Molten metal poured into molds. Endless lines of workers moving in synchronized precision. To the men in Berlin, war was fought with divisions and generals. But America was waging it with engines and factories. Each clang of a press thousands of miles away was another heartbeat in the arsenal that would soon roll toward Europe. The numbers weren't propaganda. They were a warning. One the Reich had no way to silence. When the world slipped into war in 1939, the United States still lived in a rhythm of peace. Its factories built automobiles, refrigerators, and radios, symbols of prosperity, not destruction. But across the Atlantic, the skies over Europe had already turned black. London burned, Poland fell, and France was only months from collapse. President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw what others still doubted, that this distant conflict would one day test America itself. In December 1940, he addressed the nation and declared that the United States must become the arsenal of democracy. It was not yet a call to arms. It was a call to production. By 1941, this vision began reshaping the very landscape of the nation. Car plants in Detroit stopped producing sedans and began producing Sherman tanks. Shipyards along the coasts built Liberty ships faster than anyone had believed possible. One launched every few days. Factories that once made sewing machines now turned out machine guns. Women joined the workforce in record numbers, welding, riveting, and assembling in the glow of molten steel. Every train line that left the Midwest carried engines, armor plates, and crates of ammunition. America was learning that victory would not come from the battlefield alone. It would be forged on the assembly line. To German observers, the transformation was almost invisible at first. Intelligence officers noted a rise in U.S. steel output, but dismissed it as statistical bravado. Yet beneath those dry figures lay a growing storm. One built not on ideology or conquest, but on precision, organization, and the power of a united workforce. Each passing week, the heartbeat of American industry grew louder, pulsing across the ocean toward a continent still at war. In the flat farmland west of Detroit, an empire of steel rose almost overnight. It was called Willow Run, a single factory stretching more than a mile from end to end. Designed by Ford engineers not to build cars, but bombers. Here, workers assembled B-24 Liberators in an unbroken flow of parts, machines, and men. At its peak, one aircraft rolled off the line every hour. By the summer of 1942, the plant embodied Roosevelt's mobilization dream. He had summoned the industrial titans of the nation, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Boeing, and told them to fight not with bullets, but with output. The War Production Board converted consumer capitalism into organized efficiency. No more washing machines, no more new cars, only tanks, guns, and aircraft. The coordination bordered on the unbelievable. Steel from Pennsylvania, rubber from Louisiana, aluminum from Washington. All converged on vast assembly lines where a workforce of men and women, veterans and migrants, worked around the clock under floodlights that turned night into day. In Germany, intelligence reports began to surface describing Willow Run and similar facilities. One report, recovered after the war, noted in disbelief that the Americans build entire factories faster than we complete a single prototype. Another warned that their war potential grows geometrically, not arithmetically. To those inside the Reich's shrinking industrial core, it sounded like fantasy. Yet every Liberty ship, every Sherman tank, every crate marked Detroit Ordnance that reached the front proved it real. From the skies of Michigan to the docks of New York, the hum of engines became America's war anthem. It was a sound carried on the wind, a promise that the weapons of freedom were already on their way. The American assembly line had become a battlefield of its own, precise, tireless, and fueled not by blood, but by rhythm. In places like Willow Run, Cleveland Tank Arsenal, and Pittsburgh steel mills, men and women worked under the constant hum of machinery that never slept. For every soldier carrying a rifle, dozens more stood before furnaces, presses, and conveyors, turning raw ore into weapons of liberation. Technologically, it was a revolution in motion. Henry Ford's concept of continuous flow manufacturing, once meant for cars, was repurposed for war. A single line could produce 25 tanks a day, with interchangeable parts designed for swift replacement in the field. Engineers developed standardized blueprints, allowing any factory across the country to build identical components without delay. What the Axis nations crafted by hand, the Americans produced by method. Yet it was not only machines that made this possible. It was people. Housewives became welders. Farmers became mechanics. Artists and students joined the shift rotations. At every station, faces were smeared with oil and soot, but their expressions carried quiet pride. They were not simply workers, they were the unseen division of democracy. The U.S. had achieved something neither Berlin nor Tokyo understood: the unification of free citizens under industrial discipline without coercion. Motivation replaced fear. Wages replaced propaganda. Every bolt fastened, every plate welded became a vote for survival. In the clang and roar of these vast halls, the tank was no longer a weapon of destruction alone. It was a symbol, proof that freedom could organize itself with precision and endurance equal to any dictatorship. By late 1943, inside the thick concrete walls of the German General Staff in Berlin, the reports had grown consistent and deeply troubling. American output figures no longer read like propaganda. They were statistical proof of a war Germany could no longer match. The Wehrmacht's armored divisions were still formidable, but the balance was shifting. A Panther tank required nearly 150,000 man-hours to construct. An American M4 Sherman took less than a third of that time. Germany built tanks in workshops with craftsmen fitting parts by hand. America built them as products, streamlined, repeatable, and abundant. When Allied forces landed in North Africa and later in Italy, the scale of U.S. logistics stunned German observers. Replacement tanks arrived within weeks. Damaged vehicles were repaired with parts shipped from across an ocean. In contrast, German armor lay stranded for want of a single gear or bearing. Inside the Reich Ministry for Armaments, Albert Speer urged Hitler to centralize and standardize production. But it was already too late. The Allies had built not just factories, they had built systems. Every truck, train, and assembly line in America formed part of a living network capable of adapting, scaling, and delivering faster than any command decree. Captured German officers would later admit their disbelief. One post-war report noted, "We calculated in divisions. The Americans calculated in tons." To them, the American tank was not terrifying for its firepower alone. It was terrifying because there were always more, the sound that haunted German. Intelligence was no longer artillery or engines. It was the mechanical pulse of production, steady, endless, and unstoppable. By the spring of 1944, the hum of American industry reached a roar that spanned oceans. In Detroit, St. Louis, and Baltimore, every sunrise began with the same ritual: sirens blaring, gates opening, and rivers of workers pouring into factories. The numbers defied comprehension. 40,000 Sherman tanks, 100,000 aircraft, tens of thousands of jeeps, trucks, and artillery pieces, each bearing the stamp of a nation that no longer questioned its purpose. The Allied invasion of Europe was not merely a military operation. It was the physical manifestation of this vast industrial rhythm. Behind every landing craft at Normandy stood an assembly line back home. Behind every tank that rolled off a French beach was another already on a train heading east. The logistical chain stretched like an iron vein from Chicago's mills to the hedgerows of France. German generals, reading intercepted reports, understood what was unfolding. Their maps could no longer account for the scale of the American advance. Each destroyed Sherman was replaced within days. Each airfield bombed was restocked before dusk. The war of attrition, once Germany's strength, had been reversed. For every Panther lost, there were 5 more Shermans waiting somewhere across the sea. When the first waves of Sherman tanks crested the Norman hedgerows in June 1944, German tank crews at first fought with confidence. The Panther's gun was superior, its armor thicker, its range longer. But as the days turned into weeks, something unsettling emerged from the smoke. The realization that no matter how many Shermans burned, more kept coming. Each dawn brought new columns moving through the mist, engines rumbling like the echo of an assembly line thousands of miles away. The Germans began to speak of Eisenlawine, the Iron Avalanche. It wasn't just the tanks themselves that overwhelmed them. It was the endless cycle of supply, repair, and replacement that no European industry could replicate. At German headquarters, reports turned grim. Frontline units demanded reinforcements that no longer existed. Fuel was rationed by the leader. Replacement tanks arrived too few, too late, often missing critical parts. One officer wrote in his diary, "They fight with machines as if they grow from the ground." In truth, they grew from Detroit, from the pulse of furnaces, the rhythm of presses, and the determination of free laborers who never saw the front, yet decided its outcome. By the winter of 1944, the sound of German industry had quieted. Allied bombers had reduced much of the Ruhr to ruins, but the greater damage had already been done. By arithmetic, Germany could no longer replace what it lost. Each Tiger tank destroyed meant months of production gone. Each aircraft lost drained fuel and labor Germany no longer had. Across the Atlantic, the opposite was true. The U.S. economy had reached its wartime zenith. Assembly lines produced tanks faster than they could be shipped. Fields of crated vehicles waited on docks, engines sealed against salt and rain. For every man fighting overseas, 16 supported him from home. Farmers, welders, machinists, engineers. Strategically, this imbalance crushed the Reich's final hope for parity. Even as German forces counterattacked in the Ardennes, the material difference was visible. Allied convoys moved forward with an abundance of fuel and spare parts. German divisions stalled from lack of both. By early 1945, American factories had delivered more than 88,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, and 2.4 million trucks. The war had become a contest of endurance, and only one nation had the capacity to endure indefinitely. The American soldier advanced not alone, but with the weight of an entire economy behind him. An invisible army of workers who never saw the front lines but built its every victory. When the war ended in 1945, the ruins of Germany told one story, but its captured archives told another. Allied investigators uncovered reports, memoranda, and intercepted intelligence analyses revealing how deeply German leadership had misjudged the scale of America's industrial power. Albert Speer, testifying after the war, admitted that the Reich's defeat was a matter of production mathematics. No strategy or weapon could match a nation that built factories faster than Europe could rebuild cities. One German economist later calculated that by 1943, the United States alone outproduced the entire Axis combined, not just in tanks and aircraft, but in locomotives, trucks, and raw steel. Post-war studies conducted by German and Japanese analysts read like technical autopsies. They noted with astonishment the American reliance on interchangeable parts, the decentralized supply networks, and the capacity to mobilize civilian labor without authoritarian control. The conclusion was both simple and humbling. The arsenal of democracy had proven that freedom could outproduce tyranny. Even in peacetime, the echoes of this realization lingered. The same factories that once forged Sherman tanks soon turned back to automobiles, appliances, and airplanes. symbols of recovery and abundance. The war had revealed not just American strength, but the resilience of a system that could shift from destruction to creation almost overnight. To the men who once dismissed it as impossible, the truth became undeniable. The hum of the American factory had been the real drumbeat of victory. Long after the guns fell silent, one sound endured: the slow, steady rhythm of machines. In the vast halls of Detroit and Cleveland, the same presses that once shaped armor plates now stamped fenders and washing drums. The same cranes that lifted tanks from assembly lines now lowered the bones of new cities into place. The war had proven that democracy's greatest weapon was not the rifle or the bomb, but the collective will of its citizens. Each rivet, each welded seam, each factory siren had been an act of faith. Faith that freedom could organize itself with purpose, that millions of individuals could move in harmony without fear. To German generals, the American tank once symbolized an impossible pace, an avalanche of steel that no strategy could contain. But to the Americans who built it, the tank was something different. It was proof that liberty could be engineered, mass-produced, and driven forward by unity alone. In every Sherman that crossed Europe was the echo of 1,000 hands. The machinist tightening bolts at dawn, the welder lighting her torch, the foreman calling the next shift to work. Together they formed a quiet army of creation that defeated one of destruction. History often remembers the explosions, the battles, the generals. But victory in the Second World War was also measured in the hum of engines, in the glow of molten metal, in the heartbeat of industry that never stopped. America had built not only tanks, it had built the idea that free people, when united by purpose, could outproduce fear itself. And in the cold winter nights of 1945, as German officers faced the ruins of their cities, the distant echo of that sound still carried across the ocean. The rhythmic pulse of freedom, forged in steel and beating on into peace.